I want to start by thanking everyone who's here. I really appreciate you coming out to hear me talk. I want to thank the Center for Dominican Studies for giving me the opportunity to address you. As Sister Joan mentioned, my training is primarily as a field biologist. Most of my research has been on birds, but I've also spent time working with other organisms such as fish. I had the opportunity to work with elephant seals. And so I've spent a lot of time out in nature, experiencing these organisms and the habitats in which they live. I was hired as the environmental science professor here in 2012. And while I had previously had interests in the environment and our effects on the environment, this was my first opportunity to really take that long and careful look at how humans interact with the environment. Environmental science is that science of thinking about how do we as humans use the environment, affect the environment, interact with the environment. What is that relationship like where we both benefit from and can affect that environment? So while my experiences in field biology are certainly part of that, environmental science is very much multidisciplinary. There's many, many viewpoints represented, various fields of study, both within what would be considered the hard sciences and outside of it. And so one of the things that I would always do in my environmental science course, which is a freshman course, a 100-level course, intended for people who are either majoring in environmental science or a lot of education students will take that course, is I would ask them these questions on the first day of class. The general, who are you, what's your major, why are you taking this class? But then also, would you consider yourself an environmentalist? How do you think you impact the environment? Do you make decisions based on impacts you might have on the environment? Because I wanted to see those viewpoints. I wanted to see how people were thinking about the environment and their place in it. The responses were all surprisingly predictable, regardless of the specific major or specific background of the student. Almost everybody said, I'm not an environmentalist, but I recycle. It was kind of just this expected thing, this social norm that recycling has become something that, well, almost everyone does. The first time I taught the course, I went through the semester and we discussed all the standard topics of environmental science, thinking about things like where does our food come from, how do we affect the water cycle, all those sorts of things. And we got to the end, and I had a comment on a course evaluation that said, it was an okay class, I'm just not interested in the subject matter. And that sort of shocked me. I read that and I thought, how can that be that we've just spent the entire semester talking about these things? And hopefully that student had been exposed to this idea that we as humans, we need the environment, that we are integrally a part of and dependent upon nature, that everything that we do, we can trace back to the benefits that we receive from the environment. If we eat food, that food has been grown in nature by natural processes. If we breathe in fresh air, that oxygen has come from photosynthetic organisms like the trees and the grass outside. And the water that Sister Joan mentioned is incredibly important. This very small percentage of the water on Earth is available for use by us as fresh water that we can get to. And we depend upon nature to help us with that, to provide that as clean water that we can use for our purposes. Additionally, one of the things I covered in the course was that we can affect these things. If we think about something like water, we can affect the water cycle by doing things like building roads, by building buildings that now prevent water from percolating down through the soil to make it down into that groundwater from which we draw a lot of our water resources. And so this idea that this student has been exposed to all those things, has discovered that she has this place in the environment from which she benefits every day of her life and that she can have effects on, and then says, I'm not interested in that subject matter, was this shock, and I think goes to this bigger question of how we as humans view ourselves and how that relates then to the common good. During convocation, Student Senate President Teresa Verasso was talking about the Catholic intellectual tradition and its definition of the common good. And the definition that she used, which I believe that she received from one of Dr. Carson's classes, was that the common good is that set of conditions without which there can be no individual or social good. Now, from my view as an environmental scientist, what could be more foundational than creating this set of conditions, than those conditions that allow us to survive, to live in the first place? That if we don't have life, if we don't have those resources necessary to keep us alive, well, there's no opportunity for good, there's no opportunity for anything. And so that view of the common good, that it's these conditions, it's not necessarily specific actions or specific ways people interact with each other, but instead is those conditions that allow those things to happen, ties directly in with the idea of environmental science, studying this environment that allows us to survive. So here's the question then that I have. If we acknowledge this, that we need in the need, not like I need a cup of coffee in the morning, but need in the sense if I don't have it, I'm going to die. If we need this environment, why is not every one of us every day thinking about how am I affecting that environment? What are these decisions that I'm making? How are they having positive or negative consequences for that environment on which we all rely? Why would we ever make decisions that would have a detrimental effect on this thing that is a necessity for not only ourselves but everyone else? And I think as I contemplated that, I've been able to narrow it down to three primary reasons. The first is that we as humans are not very good at identifying cause and effect unless the effects are immediate and dramatic. That if something happens and immediately we see the results of that, then we make that strong connection. But if we do something and we don't know the effect, or the effect doesn't happen for a week or a month or a year, if it's not obvious to see that link, we're really bad at identifying that our action has caused that consequence. And it turns out that nature is this large, complicated, and complex system where identifying cause and effect is not easy. And so by missing that link sometimes, we just fail to realize that our actions may have these consequences, even though they might be very important, far-reaching, and negative consequences. Secondly, even when we recognize negative consequences, even when we know something may be detrimental for us, we sometimes still make bad decisions. We still sometimes make decisions that we know are not good. You may have heard recently during the various awarding of the various Nobel Prizes, Professor Richard Thaler from the University of Chicago won this year's Nobel Prize in economics. And Professor Thaler is primarily known for his introduction of the idea of irrationality into economics. That previous economic models were based on the idea of people making economic decisions based on the costs and the benefits. That any sane person would look at the cost versus the benefit and would weigh those, and the decision that they would make would follow logically from those costs and benefits. And Professor Thaler said, these decisions are being made by people, and people are relatively often irrational. They often make decisions that don't make any sense. That if we look at them logically, if we measure out the costs and the benefits, we would say, no, there's no way we should do that, but yet people do it. Outside the realm of economics, I suppose we could look at something like the use of cigarettes. Smoking, it turns out, not good for you. This is widely known now. People still do it. It's an irrational decision. It's a decision that knows there's a negative consequence, and yet people may decide that they're okay with that negative consequence. Well, in the same way that Richard Thaler added irrationality in economics, I feel that needs to be added in to the ideas of environmental science. That we make decisions as humans based not on what we know to be the best decision, but based on how we currently feel, how our day was, what we feel like doing because I can do it, nobody can tell me I can't. That irrationality is a necessity in environmental questions. The third reason has to do with the way that environmental consequences are distributed in the landscape. And what I mean is, a lot of the consequences, I should say the negative consequences of our decisions, will diffuse out away from us. An example could be if we're thinking about a factory that is producing some sort of chemical and has a toxic byproduct from that. That toxic byproduct may not just stay at that factory, but may end up in the water or in the air, and thus be distributed over a broad area. What that means is that that diffusion causes that negative consequence to not just be for those who produced it, those in that factory, but instead actually lessens the negative consequences for those at the factory, but spreads it out to everyone else in that area. And so even if someone makes a poor decision, they may not have to experience the full consequences of that. They're able to share that burden, if you will, with other unwilling participants who might live in that area. Now, it turns out that this planet that we live on is relatively large. There's a lot of places, there's a lot of people. Because of this knowledge that negative consequences can be shared, the people who have control, either political control or economic control, tend to want to share those negative consequences less. And so what we often find is that the poorest people are those that end up sharing the greatest burden of those consequences. If we look at things like where new landfills are going to be located, we find that those are generally going to be in poorer areas. In areas where people don't have the money or the political influence or the knowledge to know how to have that political influence, to stand up against them. And so you end up with this disproportionate negative consequences for some groups of people. Now, this kind of leads me into this idea that was first really popularized by a scientist by the name of Garrett Hardin, which is the tragedy of the commons. The commons were areas where people could graze livestock, sheep for example. And they were a common area, so anyone who lived in the community could take their livestock to that area to graze. What Garrett Hardin said, he was adapting some ideas from the previous century, but what he really expounded upon was that in that sort of situation, though that common area, the common pasture land in that example, is probably going to be degraded, and that resource may be lost because it is shared by so many people. And that sharing results in these attitudes that have negative consequences for that resource. Specifically, the attitude may be, well, you know, I've only got 10 sheep out here. Maybe I'll let my sheep graze an extra day because it's only 10. That's not going to have much of a consequence. My little bit's not going to matter. What's 10 sheep and over this large pasture area? If everyone thinks in that way, then that becomes compounded from 10 sheep to thousands of sheep. Did I just say sheep? Thousands of sheep. Thus, the resource is degraded. The other side of the tragedy of the commons is the person who realizes they're having a negative consequence. If I leave my sheep here, they're going to it's not going to be good for this pasture land. But if I don't leave my sheep out here, tomorrow my neighbor's going to bring in his sheep. And those sheep are going to eat this grass anyway. So I may as well have that benefit for my sheep, because why should he have it instead of me? That if I don't use it, somebody else is going to. In that way, that common resource goes from being available to everyone to being available to no one. An example of this that we could see in a real-world practical way has to do with the population of Atlantic cod. I promise this is the only graph that I will use. I know I'm a scientist, but this is just this one. Atlantic cod is a fish that was regularly fished for many years, a very common species of fish that was caught in the North Atlantic. And large amounts of cod were captured. You can see in the graph here, the values here are in tons. So we're talking about hundreds of thousands of tons of cod being captured every year. Now, of course, this is a food resource, but it's also an economic resource. This is a resource that people are making money from, and then people are consuming. Cod, being living organisms, are able to reproduce. Thus, it is hypothetically a renewable resource. Take cod this year, allow those cod to reproduce, come back, there are cod available the next year, and the next year, and the next year. What happened was there were so many different countries and so many different fishing boats involved in capturing cod that the tragedy of the commons manifested, that so many cod were taken out of the ocean that eventually the population crashed, and then eventually crashed down to almost zero. Crashed down to where there were almost no cod left in the ocean. At that point, there was a moratorium placed on the fishing for cod. However, the cod population, while it's come back to some degree, has not come back anywhere like it was, and it's unknown if it will ever recover to the point where it was previously. In this situation, we had a resource that could be used by many for the benefit of all, but it was lost because of overuse, because of lack of foresight that this was not a perpetual resource that could be taken forever. However, there are situations where resources have been maintained for long periods of time due to cooperation from communities, due to cooperation where people have recognized that the resource will not be available forever unless they work together to maintain it. So then we ask, well, how does this happen? How are we able to keep resources available forever? And I think the answer is primarily twofold. First, there must be some regulation. Now, I know that there are strong viewpoints, maybe depending on which end of the political spectrum you're on, concerning things like government involvement. And I certainly am not a fan of the government telling me what I should do with my everyday life. However, I also know that in any community, there are individuals who are selfish and who are myopic. Those who are going to work for their own self-interest and no one else's, and who are not going to look at the long-term consequences of their actions. For those people, even if they're educated about those consequences, they're still going to make decisions that are detrimental to the resource in question. Without regulation, there's no way to keep those people from taking advantage of a resource that could benefit everyone. Additionally, many businesses are based on the use of natural resources. And it turns out that businesses are primarily focused on making money. Now, I know if you watch television commercials, you'll find out that the businesses really just want you to be happy and want to do great things for you, and that their main goal in life is to get you the best car possible, and that customer satisfaction is what they really want to do. But it's not true. The reality is that they want money. Business is in business to make a profit. And we can't fault them for that. That's what businesses do. They make money. Any business is going to be looking for the best ways to make money, the ways that require the least expenditure on their part with the most profit from it. Knowing this, we also know that that means that any business that makes a decision, an ethical or moral decision, to make good decisions for the environment is going to be at a disadvantage to any business that doesn't. A business that spends the time and resources necessary to properly dispose of toxic waste is going to be spending more money on that than the business that dumps it in the river out back. This puts them at a competitive disadvantage for making the right decision. Regulations will level that playing field. Regulations will take that and say everyone needs to do this in the same way. And instead of having a monetary incentive to do the wrong thing, the monetary incentive is to do the right thing, to not get the fines for doing the wrong thing. I think the second part, though, in addition to regulations, is even more important, and that's the educational aspect. One of the things that I try to do in my environmental science course is to encourage people to realize that their decisions matter, that they are a part of this environment, that they are part of nature. It's easy to imagine ourselves as we build our buildings and spend time in going from our car to a building and back to our car again, that we are somehow outside of or independent from nature. But when we start realizing the ways that we depend on that nature, we realize that even though we may have built these walls between us and natural places, everything that we do depends on them. Knowing that is the first step in allowing someone to make that decision that what I do may have consequences outside of myself and influencing this environment on which we all depend. One of the things that I have spent a lot of time talking about recently in my environmental science course is food. Every day, if you're like me, you eat food, sometimes multiple times per day. It turns out that that food comes from somewhere. That food does not come from the grocery store. That might be where you pick it up, but originally it was elsewhere. And the way that that food is produced has environmental impacts. Knowing what those environmental impacts are, knowing that there's a difference based on what you buy, provides a way for the average person to have a direct effect on what might seem like large-scale and intractable environmental questions. That consumer choices can actually change the way that food is raised. But knowing that there's that effect that's possible is a necessity for that to happen. One of my goals in the environmental science program is to encourage students to see their place in that environment and to make those decisions. Now, fortunately, I'm not the only one trying to do that. Sister Joan mentioned Laudato Si, Pope Francis' encyclical from 2015, where he made many of the same points that I'm trying to make, that we have this care of this common home, if you will, that the things that we are doing in this environment are affecting us and affecting everyone else, and that it is our responsibility to make sure that that is available for the benefit of everyone. That even though we may not be able to see the things that we're impacting, those things are having wide-reaching implications. Just as an example of this, I have this picture here. These are the tar sands in Alberta. This is where a lot of the oil that's produced in North America comes from. These huge areas where very few or no people live in Alberta, where they are essentially destroying the surface of the ground to try to extract this oil that is very tightly bound up with the substrate, with the rocks that it's in. It requires a huge amount of effort, a huge amount of environmental degradation. But the consequence is that we're able to produce more oil here in North America. Knowing that when you stop at the gas station to buy a tank of gas, that some of that money that you're contributing is being used to impact large areas of the Canadian wilderness, may have that impact of making a person make different decisions. Decisions that are based on this newfound knowledge of the importance and the implications that a single person can have. So, in summary, I guess my overall point is that the tragedy of the commons occurs on that global scale, that the commons is our planet, that for better or worse, we are trapped here. And the resources that are available have to benefit all of us because we don't have any other place to find anymore. By making decisions that preserve those, we can have people continue to live here for the foreseeable future. But if the decisions that we make are short-term and based not on understanding of those relationships that we have, the consequences could potentially be dire. Thank you.